Wonderful. So we'll get started today. So today is the second week of the class, and I'm going to remind everyone of the course schedule here. So everybody hopefully can see my screen with the slides. Yes, perfect. So I highlighted here week 2, we're supposed to be doing chapter 3 and 4. And what I'm going to do each week is if somebody asks a question about a certain topic from the prior week, I might cover that as well. And I know for week 1, chapter 1 and 2, chapter 1 is really not much in it at all. It's more just the setup, which you have to do the videos on Moodle, which I talked about last week in the session. But chapter 2 does have some GST. So I want to do a little bit of a reminder on how GST works, because in the Sage textbook, it goes step by step and explains things to you, but I want to do kind of just an overview, because I know when I taught this class in person, some people had a little bit of challenges with it. So I want to just do a little review in case anyone did have struggles with it. And then I'll do a little demo on chapter 3 and 4, because that's where we're actually getting into the meat of recording things in Sage and looking at reports. And that's what we're going to go through next. Does anyone have any questions about this schedule, first of all, before we move on? Because I know there might be some new people in the session. If you have any questions, you can ask them now. Seeing nothing, and if you do have a question and you don't want to speak up, you can obviously put it in the chat as well, and I'll try to keep looking at that as we go. All right, so if you did miss last week at all, or you just registered for the class, make sure you download all the student data files to use throughout the course. So there are videos right on Moodle to do that. And I'm going to get Ryan to talk a little bit about that in a moment here. And this replaces the instructions in chapter 1 about where the files are saved, because the textbook does have a disk where you can do it, but we don't do it that way. We use everything in Moodle because we use what's called Citrix, because that allows you to save files and do a whole bunch of things. So Ryan, do you want to just talk about maybe some of the challenges you had, in case that helps some of the other students if they're trying to download things?
Sure. Might actually be easier just to share my screen rather than trying to describe it.
Sure, yeah. If you don't, this will be a good test. If you ever want to teach Ryan sharing the screen with students, it's a little bit challenging at first, but if everyone, does this help? Maybe I should ask first before Ryan does that. If everyone in the session already has done it, it won't be as big a deal. Mind you, I guess it's recorded. So yeah, go ahead, Ryan, try to share. I might have to let you share. So I'm going to maybe stop sharing. See if that'll help.
Yeah, it says it's disabled right now for participants.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to, let me see. I just said multiple participants can share. So let's see if that'll work.
We're good now.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Yeah, so my first, when I first did it, I went through, I think, right here, and did got to the Moodle website through here. Like I actually searched for it myself. And when you do that, it doesn't give you the proper area to save files and whatnot. So I had to go through here. I don't know if it'll...
So that's a good comment, because it might be a little confusing, because there's Internet Explorer 11, Citrix, and then there's Moodle for Sage. So make sure you click Moodle for Sage. Thanks for that, Ryan.
That was the main thing. But then after that, I mean, everything in the video shows, it's not loading anyways. So everything that is shown in the videos is pretty straightforward from that point on. You just have to make sure that you use save as rather than save. Because if you have to do every one of them individually, but if you just click the file and then click save, it'll just, I don't know where it puts it. So, but if you actually click the little arrow on where it says save, the drop-down menu, then it goes to save as, and then you can pick the folder that you created.
Yeah, and that's one thing I thank you for mentioning that, Ryan. I have that problem or I shouldn't say problem. This is something I learned for everything that I've done in computers. I use OneDrive a lot now with all of my files, and I have the same problem. If I click save, typically on my computer, just to give you guys a little tip on this, a lot of my files will save in downloads on my computer. And that's obviously not where you want it in this course. And it's also not the place you want it in most situations. Say you want to save a file for anything. Basically there, you would want to make sure you go save as so you can put it in whatever folder you want. So that's great for everything you're saving on your computer, and especially in this course. And I do see something, some questions on chat. So let me just look. For chapter 2, do we have to do anything on Sage? So chapter 2, there is a few things on GST that you do have to do. So yes, there is some stuff in Sage to do. I'm going to do a little bit of review on just GST, but make sure you do go through chapter 2. There's not very much in there, but just a little bit showing you how the GST accounts work. And then Devin said we can do everything through the web portal rather than the desktop app, correct? And that is correct, yes. Sam says he's having issue with dates. I assume, are you talking about Sage dates?
Yeah, so every time I go to post, like I was only able to get to, I don't even know, like step 4 or something, because every time it tells me when you put the date in and you go to post it, it always tells me that it doesn't allow you to post to the future.
Right.
So it seems like all my dates are wrong.
Yeah, I can explain probably what you're doing wrong in that when we do the demo, because what happens is in Sage you have a session date, and if you're trying to future date, it doesn't work. So I'll show you how to change the session date when I do the demo. And if I forget, remind me then when we go in, because I want to go through the slides. Then I'm going to share my screen for actual Sage just to show you some things in there. So that's
thank you very much.
No problem. And Ryan says he called IT for Citrix and said they do not use the desktop app anymore. So that's great too. I want to talk about the stuff in the chat too, just so that when we have the recording, people that are watching afterwards can understand the questions, because questions you guys have, probably other people will have as they go through the course too. So that's fantastic. Thanks for all your help, Ryan, going through that, showing people what to do there. We'll go back to the slides here. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, perfect. So hopefully everybody has accessed the files, saved them all in the correct folders. You do have to, and you might have to go through the videos in Moodle one more time when we get to the assignment submissions, and do that before exams as well, because there is a video on that. And obviously if you watch it now, it doesn't really help you because you're not doing anything that way. So for now, the videos on the saving of the files is the most important. So chapter 2 is about taxes. So I just wanted to do a little bit of a review on GST, because you might have covered this in introductory accounting. This class is not really meant to teach you accounting. It's more to teach you about Sage. But if you do have accounting questions, you might want to go back to your introductory accounting textbooks. But in this case, it's a common question people have is, how does GST work? And if you look at the Sage textbook, it doesn't really, it shows you how to do it and everything like that and talks about it briefly, but I thought it was useful to do a little review. So when a company is collecting GST from a customer, what happens is they have to remit that to Canada Revenue Agency. So from an accounting perspective, it means it's a liability. We owe money to CRA. That means you're going to have a credit in your journal entry. And when you're looking in the Sage textbook, it calls the account GST charged on sales. So it's a credit because it's a liability. We need to pay that. So remember, just as a quick review, assets are debits because they're assets, and liabilities are credits. Then on the other side of it, whenever we make a purchase as a company, we pay GST on it typically, unless it's GST exempt. And we get what's called an input tax credit. So I'm going to refer to that as an ITC when I talk about taxes. So an input tax credit is basically a receivable from the government. Therefore, it is a debit balance. And we call that in the Sage textbook GST paid on purchases. So what we actually pay when we do our GST return at the end of the period, now companies will remit either quarterly, monthly, or annually, depending on the size of the company. So what we would do if we were doing a GST return in real life is we would look in our GST collected and our GST paid, and the net amount is what we have to pay to the government. So we take our amount of GST collected from our customers minus the amount we paid on our purchases, and that is the amount that we have to remit on our return. Okay, so when we get further on in the course, we're going to actually learn how to set up tax codes in Sage, because we won't always be doing journal entries to record transactions. So you'll note in the first couple chapters, you're doing just like you did in introductory accounting, where if you had a sales transaction to a customer, for example, you would debit accounts receivable, credit sales revenue, credit GST collected from customers. That's a journal entry, right? And we're doing a general journal. I'll show a demo of that when we get to the demo part. But in actuality, if you did journal entries for every transaction every day, you might as well just be using a paper system, right? You're not using what Sage helps us to do, which is to do things more quickly. And when we start doing actual invoices in Sage and things like that, we will have tax codes. So it'll make it a little simpler. So does anyone have questions on the GST there that we've talked about, or does that make sense? See nothing popping up, so we'll move on then. So just to talk about chart of accounts briefly, how Sage works is the company's chart of accounts, you would want to use any accounts that are already created for every client. And I talk about this when I'm working in public accounting as well as in this course. So if you, the textbook is great because it'll tell you, you know, post it to this account, but eventually you're going to get to the stage where it'll ask you to post an invoice and they're not going to tell you what accounts to use, but you would be required to look at the actual chart of accounts for that particular company or client to pick which account is required. And you don't ever want to create a new account unless there isn't one that already exists. So whenever you're about to post a transaction, make sure you look at the existing chart of accounts to see if an account is good. So for example, one company might have just one sales GL because they sell product, and all of a sudden they start a new line of business for doing service for customers, then you would probably need to create a new account called service revenue. But I mean, in most cases, if it's a client that does both, you would have two separate GLs, one for sales and one for service, and you would just make sure you pick the correct one. So I put the textbook reference, page 37, if you're wanting to review this, to look at how the chart of account works. And then I just put the numbering sequence that Sage uses, which is coming from the textbook, page 41 here. So the 1,000 accounts are assets, 2,000 is liabilities, 3,000 is equity, 4,000 is revenue, and 5,000 is expense. So when you're entering a transaction in Sage, rather than just clicking the account button and scrolling through everything, you could type the first digit. If you knew you needed to search for revenue accounts, you could just type 4. And then it'll bring up everything from the 4s and down. So you have to scroll a little bit less. So that's where this helps you, is to look at the type of accounts you're wanting to find. It can make things a little quicker. So I will, like I said, do a demo using the sample company after we're done the slides, but I put some snippets in here of what it looks like. So if you want to look at the chart of accounts, you would click company on the left, the chart of accounts button here that I highlighted. And then underneath that, there's view account, add account, modify account, and remove account. Under the general journal, you can do everything in there for journal entry. So underneath it, if you click the arrow, you'll see create journal entry, find journal entry, and adjust journal entry. So has anyone become familiar with these already, where you're like, yep, I know this already, this is pretty easy? Nobody's commenting, but if you haven't already, this is something you will get familiar with down the road. And later on, by the way, we will work on shortcuts. So you can see on my top picture a little button called shortcut. I'm not going to go through it now because the textbook will show you how to do it later. But if I look at my Sage, because I use Sage for my rental business, under shortcuts, I have create general journal. I have post invoice. I have balance sheet, income statement, and so on. All the stuff that I use regularly, you could put in your shortcuts so you don't have to find it in the individual menus. So that will make things easier later on. The general ledger transaction list. So here I put some snippets of things that you will basically want to refer to. You'll see how to do all of this through the textbook, but these are things where often when I was teaching in the lab, people will be like, I forget how to find my general ledger transaction list. So when I'm working in an accounting firm, for example, journal entries are where things often get done wrong. Because if you do an invoice, Sage is pretty good at recognizing how you usually post them. We can do what's called recurring transactions. But if you're doing an individual journal entry as a one-off, that's places where people might do backwards debits and credits, for example, right? So what I might want to do if I was reviewing a student's records, or if I was reviewing yours, if you're submitting an assignment, I'm going to get the general ledger transaction list. And I put the little, I guess picture of how you would do that. You go into reports, you go into this transaction details. You could do all, but in this case, I would do general because you could check all purchases, payments, sales, whatever. But if I want to see all the journal entries, that's where I would go for that. And there's different menus you go to for different reports. So that's why I wanted to show some of the snippets of how this works. So under reports, transaction details, general, that's where you'll get your transaction list. If you want to look at your chart of accounts, you would go under reports in Sage, then you would look at lists, and then you would click chart of accounts, okay? So again, that's another place, it's called lists. Next thing is where you go for reports. And this is when I first started using Sage, I had this problem of I'd go into reports, then I go, where do I go? So you go into reports, you go into financials, and then you can see here balance sheet, income statement, trial balance, etc. That's easy, right? But not everything's in there. For example, those things are there, but the other things we already showed, we might have to go to the list or we might have to go into the transaction details. So those are kind of the three menus that are covered in Chapter 3 under the report button is financials for the balance sheet, income statement, and trial balance, lists for the chart of accounts and the accounts, and then transaction details for the list of the general ledger transactions. So I just wanted to remind you of that. Then the next thing I'm going to talk about, and I know we already had the question on that, is how to advance the session date. And then the last thing I wanted to remind you guys of is for Chapter 3, to make sure you do backups regularly. So the textbook will tell you when to do a backup, right? It'll say, you know, you finished, say it's a week of transactions, now do a backup. It'll explain how to do that. But if you need to do one at a different time, it's okay to do that. So as an example, let's say, for example, you're doing a week of transactions and you don't finish it and something comes up. You have to leave, someone's at your door, whatever, you decide you're going to work on it later tonight instead. It doesn't hurt before you shut down to go ahead and do a backup just in case something goes wrong. So it's never bad to do an extra backup. Just make sure you do it for sure when the textbook tells you to. And make sure you name it appropriately. So if the backup was for the end of the week and the textbook tells you to save it as whatever it tells you, you could just say midweek, you know, for whatever date, and so that you know it's one that you created on your own. Or you could even put the page reference in the textbook, backup up to page 42 or whatever, so that you know. And that's the only reason you do that is if something happened where you get a corrupt file in Sage, doesn't happen very often, at least you could go back to page 42 and restart from that point. Because otherwise, if you did a whole chapter, say you finish all of Chapter 4 and it's many, many transactions and your file's corrupted and you have no backup, you'd have to redo that whole chapter. And the same thing in real life. If you were entering a whole month of transactions and you waited till the end of the month to do the backup and the file's corrupted, you'd have to do that whole month again. Whereas if you did a backup each week, you'd only have to go back from that week. So hopefully that helps you guys understand how that works. So now what I'm going to do is take a little bit of a break from the slides before we move on to Chapter 4 and do a little demo of what we've talked about so far. So I'm going to stop sharing so that I can share something separate now. Can you guys see my Sage screen now? Perfect. Okay, so what did we want to talk about here? So I'm going to show what I already showed on this slide, but here, the chart of accounts. If you wanted to do anything, make sure, if you're in the dashboard, it looks like this, where you basically have all the sort of a summary of different report screens that people might want to see for their company. I'm in the sample company here just to do the demo. So in Sage, there is a sample company you can play with just to see transactions. And this is a good place to play if you say, I just want to kind of get familiar with things. So company is where I can look at my chart of accounts and I can do my general journal, right? So if I go into create a general journal, I just wanted to show this as well. Can you see my general journal screen there? No, it doesn't probably work because it comes up separately. That's the problem with sharing one screen on Zoom. It's not actually showing it. Well, I guess what I'll just tell you, explain it then. If I go into create general journal here.
It did show it after a minute, Linda.
Oh, it just took time. Okay, good. Okay, you guys can see it? Okay, so in here, there's different buttons I just wanted to show you. So I know that on here, the general journal, I could go in here and click adjust the journal entry, but I don't need to do that. If I go into the create button, there's actually an icon to do an adjustment as well. And this is when I'm working, I typically do it this way. If I'm doing a whole bunch of journal entry postings, I could go into here and say, well, I want to adjust an entry. I click this little pen button here, adjust the previously processed. It asks me for what dates I want to look. I say, okay. I could click on whatever entry I want, select it, and then I could go ahead and make changes to the dollar value or the account and just pick something different. So this is what I do if I find an error when one of my staff in the firm made a mistake. I could just go in and change it to the right account here, and I go cancel. Now, what if I clicked on this and I was just looking at it, but I realized, oh, no, it's okay. I don't need to change it. I won't process because I didn't make a change. I could just close it. And it'll say, are you sure you want to discard it? I say, yes. That's not deleting the transaction. That's deleting my change to the transaction. So when I'm entering a journal entry and I put all the data in here, my source, my date, my comment, my actual account, obviously I would click process. But if I just wanted to adjust something and I realize I don't need to, then you can just cancel out of it. The other thing we're going to learn later on is how to do recurring transactions. And that's these two buttons right here. If you have an entry you want to store, you would store it as a recurring and you would recall it here. So you'll learn that later on. And that's what's going to save you a lot of time if you're using Sage in the future to do transactions that happen weekly, monthly, etc. So I think that's about all we needed to talk about. One other thing is if you've done a journal entry, like if I go into an actual entry, this is a month-end entry, so it's fairly large here. You can also go into here and you can do lots of other things. So just look at the different reports. Like I could go here and go display journal entry detail, and it'll show it to me on a printed screen. So there's lots of different things you can do right in that menu. And the good thing about Sage, one of the good things I find with it is that I can change this anytime I want and process it. Some other accounting softwares I've used, you can't actually go into an entry and change it. What you'd have to do is reverse this actual entry and then go back and do a new one, which is a lot harder. Because what if I just had the wrong account for this and I wanted to change it? Sage makes it very easy to do that. So next thing, yes, I don't want to do anything with that transaction, so I'm going to discard it. What else did I want to cover? So the reports button, I already showed this. Reports, I can go into lists to look at my chart of accounts or my account. I could go into financials, look at the balance sheet, income statement, trial balance. I can go into my transaction details and find my general ledger details. So I think that's all we covered for that. And then the last thing I wanted to cover is the session date. So if I'm trying to post a transaction, right now my session date is right here. Can you guys see where I'm highlighting on the screen? Session date, March 31st, 2025. Yep. So if I was trying to post something for April 1st, 2025, I will get an error. So I could try that right now. And that's presuming that they have it set up where you're not allowed to do future dated. If I put this date in and try to post, well, I won't try to do it because then maybe it'll let me, they don't have the right setting. If I put this date and I get an error saying you can't do future dated, close out of the screen, go into session date, click it, and then change it. Say now you're doing April and you just forgot to change it to April, hit okay. And then it says, it's giving me a warning. It's more than 1 week past, because normally we don't do a whole month at a time, we do a week. But if I wanted to do a whole month, I would just say, okay. Don't do that if the textbook tells you to do a week though. Just make sure that if you're entering a transaction that you advanced your session date as you should have. So that should help you with the problem with the journal entries in the future.
Okay, Linda. So when I go back to start all of this again from like number 4, I just change that date to the like future date.
Yeah, and it should have told you, you probably just missed it on the page in the textbook where it said adjust your session date to be one date. So just look up back a couple transactions and it'll tell you what your date should be.
Okay, thank you.
And it shouldn't mean you have to redo much of anything. It's just the one entry you were working on that didn't let you post. The other thing
so if I posted it to the wrong date, how do I go in to fix that? Because
that's what I was about to say.
I kind of did that. I was like, okay, well, I'll just put it for this date because it wouldn't let me do June 3rd. So I did June 2nd. So I'll probably need to change that.
Yeah, so let's go into one as an example. So let's say this entry here, it's a transfer to payroll. And let's say you accidentally posted it March 31st here, right? Because you didn't have it be able to post later. All I had to do is I just click this pen, adjust the previously processed transaction. And then I had already done that, so it's up. And then I could just change the date. I would just go in here and I'd say, no, I wanted to post this April 1st, and now I'm just gonna process it. And it says, warning, you can only process 100 transactions. So I can't actually post here because it's a sample company, but in your case, Sam, this would work where you would just change your date here when you click that pen. So click the pen, find the entry you want to adjust, change the date here, and then process it. But make sure first you change your session date. Does that help with that?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions about this? I think I covered everything from chapter 3 the most of the stuff that you would be learning. Again, make sure you do everything in the chapter because I'm only just demoing very small things in here, and processing is also giving you a good review from intro accounting. And in this course, you will be marked on your accounting entries as well. So yes, the course is about Sage, but it does review all the stuff that you learned in your intro accounting classes because you're still doing journal entries, right? So at some times, like I said, you're gonna have to know what to debit and what to credit as well. So now I will stop my screen share again and we'll go back to the slides to go into chapter 4. Can you guys see chapter 4 now? The slides? Perfect. Okay, so what chapter 4 talks about, I'm not really going to do a demo on it right now. If I get questions from people, I'll show them in next week's session, because in this one, I'm just going to show kind of what you're doing. And in this one, you're doing basically a lot of things with the chart of accounts in this chapter. So you'd be creating a brand new company and a chart of accounts, including entering in account balances at the beginning of using Sage. So for example, if you have a company, let's say you were doing manual bookkeeping in the past, or you had an Excel spreadsheet and you have all your transactions, or in an accounting firm, we took over a new client and we get their opening trial balance, say their year end was December 31st, 2021, and we want to start using Sage for January 1st, 2022, what we're going to do is we're going to need to enter all the opening balances. So the organization of the accounts is critical. And this is a place where I want to just talk about a little bit. So I put the snippet from the textbook of the organization of the account. So if you look here under assets, it has a section heading called, it says H is 1,000 current assets. And you can see different letters, A, A, S, G, G. Everybody sees those? These are critical. And I've had, when I was working in the lab, lots of people would be like, I'm trying to add an account and I'm getting an error and I can't print reports. If you create a new account, it is critical to make sure it's in the right organization. So you could see there's a legend at the bottom here. So a H is a heading. So you could see 1,000 is current assets. That's a heading. We can't post anything to account 1,000. It's just a heading for current assets. And in our balance sheet then, all the accounts under current assets are the bank account, cash on hand, total cash, prepaid, and purchased clothing in this particular case. And you can see also that there's other codes. There's A, which is a postable subgroup account. And then there's S, which is a total. So that's a group subtotal you can see. And then the purchased clothing one, that is a G type as well. And same with prepaid. So that's a postable group account. Now, when you have these subtotals, basically what it means is that you wanted to add bank and cash together. So the accounts that you would be posting to in the current asset section, would be 1020 and 1100, not to 1150 total cash, because that's just a subtotal for our reports. Does that make sense to everyone? So on my balance sheet, I don't want to show bank and cash on hand separately. I want to show one subtotal for total cash. That is why in this example, we had 2 A's and then an F. For prepaids, there's not 2 different accounts, so I have it as a G. Let's say I had prepaids. Let's say I had prepaid insurance, prepaid advertising, prepaid marketing, and a whole bunch of things. I could have all of those as A's, and then I would have total prepaids as an F. So every company is going to be different depending what they want to show on their balance sheet. Now, the key is I can't, under prepaid here, what if I wanted to add a new account for prepaid insurance? And I put prepaid insurance in there, and I put it as a type A. I'm going to get an error unless I also have an S for a subtotal. You can't have an A type without having an S type. And this is where students end up having a lot of problems, is they go in, they add an account as an A without having an S. That's going to be a problem. Same thing is if you add something outside of the scope of a heading, it'll also give you a problem. And when you're adding new accounts, there is a little button that you have, which I'm going to show next week when we get into stage more for a demo. You would, and you'll see it in the textbook as you're going through chapter 4, where it'll say something like check validity of accounts created. As you're creating accounts, check your validity quite often, because if you've created one under current assets and you have an error, you will find it sooner. If you went and created all, let's say it told you in Sage to create this whole list right here in this slide, and you did it all, but you had a whole bunch of mistakes, one in current assets, one in current liabilities, everything, and you forgot to do some headings. Because as you're doing this, it's a lot of data entry, you might miss one. If you went and checked validity right after current assets and had a problem, you only have to check these to see where the problem is. If you went and had 3 issues and you did this whole thing, you have to go through everything to figure out where the problem is. Does that make sense? Has anyone done chapter 4 yet? Ryan, you did. Did you have problems with this at all?
I didn't have any problems with adding everything. I do have a question related to chapter 4 that we can get to after this, but as far as putting the accounts together, it was pretty simple. It's literally a step-by-step guide.
Right, and as long as you read the textbook carefully, you won't have a problem. The issue I find is students go, this is really easy, and it is, like adding accounts is pretty simple once you've done a couple, and if you're not careful and you don't follow the textbook example exactly, that's where you might be like, oh, I know how to do this. I'm just going to go add them all and look at the summary and just get them all in there and not follow the step-by-step. That's when you tend to run into problems. And even when you're doing it step-by-step, make sure you understand these A's, these S's, and these G's. Because when you get to later on creating a separate company or doing an exam or doing an assignment or in real life where you're working for a client, obviously this is more important to understand how to do it, not just following it step by step. So if you did follow it step by step, but you don't really understand what these G's, H's, and P's mean, make sure you go back and look at that so that you can get it right. Because if I said, hey, I want total cash to be on the balance sheet, I don't want these separately, how can you do that? Well, you have to have A's and S's, right? So that's just an example of if you wanted to add, let's say they only had a bank account initially and that was a G type, but we say we want to add a cash on hand and a total cash, you have to make sure your codings are correct there. Okay, so that's that. That's the chart of accounts. And then we'll get into your question in a minute here, Ryan. And the next week, so this week you should make sure you finish chapter 3 and 4. And then next week we'll have class on Monday. But if you're working ahead, you would start on chapter 5 and 6. And I already mentioned Zoom meetings will typically be Mondays unless there's a holiday. So the Zoom meeting shows that it's Monday and Wednesday now. I've updated it just so that I don't have to set up a separate Wednesday one like for today or for, I think May 23rd is the holiday and then the other holiday we have that's in the schedule. So those, anytime there's a holiday in the schedule, we'll do the class on Wednesday. Other than that, it'll be on Monday. So that's the end of the slide. So I'm going to exit out of there and stop sharing. And then we can just get into more questions. So just give me a second to go back and share Sage. Okay, go ahead, Ryan.
So I actually have two questions. One
Sure.
is kind of a stupid one, but
No questions are stupid.
We'll see. As for like the comments and the accounts and all that, I'm assuming that the actual like terminology isn't as important as the fact that you have one.
Yes, that's a good point. So for example, if you were creating a new GL for sales revenue, right? And the company's selling a certain thing. Some people will call it sales. Some people will call it sales revenue. I don't care if you had it exactly right. Same thing for expenses. You might call it sales and marketing expenses. You might just call it marketing expenses, whatever it is. Same thing or advertising. You might call it advertising expense. Some people will just call it advertising. Those things aren't critical. In the textbook, it tells you what to call it. The only thing critical in the course is if there is an account in the chart of accounts for a particular company, you have to use that right account. But if you're creating a brand new account and it doesn't give you the exact naming, as long as you have something that makes sense, that is okay. And probably that was the same as in your intro accounting where they said, as long as it makes sense for what you're trying to do, like whether you call something prepaid expenses or whether you call it prepaid insurance, as long as it's called prepaid expenses and you do the transaction correctly, that is fine.
Okay. Yeah, I was referring more so to like the journal entry specifically.
The comment, not the actual account name.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the same thing. You might, if you're doing a comment and you say, sales to Joe Smith, this date and this invoice number, whatever, and you put it in a different order, that doesn't matter. As long as you have the related detail in there, how you put it in is okay. I also don't mind if you abbreviate. And if you look at an example here, when I went into the, let me just look at this here. When I go into the general journal here and I'm just going to go into the adjust. You can see the comments here. Interest and bank charges. Here's transfer to payroll, and they abbreviated it, right? So, there's different ways you can do it. They didn't have very detailed comments. We usually put more than that. Now, what you're going to notice in the first chapters, because you're doing everything by journal entry, and you have invoices you're posting, customer invoices, purchase invoices, you're going to need a lot more detail in the comments. Down the road, when we do those as invoices, we'd be doing it under customers and sales, where we would enter a sales invoice. It's going to call it an invoice. So then we're going to have a lot less detail needed in the comment because it'll already have the customer's name, the invoice number, etc. So right now our comments are very detailed in comparison, but down the road, once we get into later chapters, we won't need near as much detail because we'll be doing things through sales invoices for customers, and for vendors and purchases, there we could go into purchase invoices and enter them. And that'll be a lot quicker as well.
Okay.
And Linda, oh, sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
No, that's go ahead. I was just commenting.
I was just going to say in every journal post or every entry should have a comment in it.
Absolutely. Make sure.
And how do we know exactly what the comments are? I only got through somewhat through chapter 2, I think, and before I had this issue with dates and stuff. So some the one where you have to do it on your own, I think the first one is number 4. How do you really know what the comments are? It's been a while since I took my accounting course, so I clearly need to refresh.
You might want to look at the sample company and just see what kind of comments they had. But in most cases, it's going to tell you the comment in the textbook. But if you were doing a sales invoice, just explain what you're doing. Sales to ABC company, invoice number, and that's pretty much it, right? Because you don't need to put the amount because that's in the entry. You don't need to put the date because you put the appropriate date. So as long as you put what it is, the company that it's for, and the invoice number, or if there is one, or receipt number, whatever it is, that would be enough information.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Ryan, do you have another comment?
Yeah, no, I don't want to get bogged down with too many details. That's why I wanted to clarify that. But
you don't want to have a comment that's 4 lines long, right? Where it has so much stuff. So yeah, as long as you can summarize it. For example, if I was reviewing say you're actually doing bookkeeping for a client and I'm reviewing it, and I want to see, hey, where did Ryan post the advertising, or where did he do insurance? Because I want to make sure he did his prepaids correctly. I should be able to just look quickly at the descriptions and go, oh, here's the insurance invoice, right? So just think of it that way. If somebody wanted to find it, how would they do it, right? Hey, TD insurance, invoice, whatever, that, you know, that kind of thing.
So my other question was regarding the, it's in chapter 4. I don't quite understand like how the test account works. Because like in the book, it tells you to create a test account for the trial balance, but I didn't like notice it actually doing anything, and I didn't really understand it.
Yeah, I think the test account is more in case something doesn't work, it posts to it. So it's not something you do in real life. It's something to balance to in case you have any issues. So if you don't have anything in it, it's good.
Okay. But what would funnel into it? I'm just wondering, like, because it doesn't really give a whole lot of detail in the book, but it tells you to like create a general account. So I'm assuming you put it under the heading of G, because that's what I did as the test account. And then, I mean, it was zeroed out to begin with when you're doing the transaction histories. So like, what would funnel into that if you did do something wrong? Just for curiosity at this point.
I'll have to look back because I haven't looked at the test account for a while to see. So let me get back to you on that one. I'll go back and look at that in chapter 4 specifically, because it's been a couple of years since I looked at it, and I know when I did it, I didn't have anything go into it, but I think I remember some students. I just can't remember. So has anyone else done chapter 4 where they saw something in the test account? I don't think anyone's probably got that far yet. Sorry, my notifications won't stop coming up for some weird reason.
Linda, can you help? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's Rebecca. Sorry, I just got into your Zoom. I was having such a difficult time. So I know that you have these under all the recording for us to access. So is, to my understanding, are we supposed to have chapter 4 finished by the end of this week, or was that for next week?
Yeah, chapter 4 is this week. And you'll see it in the slides that I'm posting for this recording. So week 1 was chapter 1 and 2, which there's not really much to do. Chapter 2 is pretty brief. It's just uploading the file. But by the end of this week, you should have chapter 3 and 4 done, Okay. Which doesn't mean by today. It means by the end of the week. And then next week, you should be starting on 5 and 6. So that's why today we're talking about chapter 3 and 4 to give you kind of a review. And then the idea is we're pretty much done the class part, and you would just keep working through those chapters now.
Okay, and I missed this part, but I just had a question because I'm still working on chapter 3.
Yeah.
When it was talking about like backing up your files and stuff. Now, I don't think I know that it automatically saves, but am I doing a backup for every week? Like that was my biggest question. I've never worked with Sage before, so it may be kind of a stupid question.
No, that's okay. We did talk about that this class. So that is a great question, because backups, generally the textbook will tell you when to do it, but I did make the comment that you can do extra ones. So you want to go save as. Ryan was great enough to share this with the class, that don't just go save, because stuff goes somewhere. You don't know where it is to access it in the future. So make sure you go save as, check where it's being saved. You should have a backup folder specifically under your files for that particular chapter. And then you would save all your backups, and doing it after a week of transactions is definitely good, because if a file got corrupted, you'd only have to go back and do that week over again versus a whole month of transactions.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I will watch the video, the recordings.
For last weekend, for this week, exactly. Plus the videos on Moodle, which we talked about last week. Those are how you set up the files, but you probably already did that part. So you probably
I did. I seen those ones. I just didn't know if there was extra videos that we were to watch, or
what I have on Moodle. What I've done is I've created a playlist in YouTube called This Class, so that all the videos, like the one from last week and this one and every other one, will just be in there, so that I don't want to have to go into Moodle and add a new place for every single one. So the playlist link that you have on Moodle will always have every single video in it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? No, and Ryan, I'll get back to you on the testing. I'll relook at that and see if I can figure out why they're doing it, because I can't remember it. If anyone else gets into the point where there is something in the test account, let me know. Because I think it was one where something goes into it, you have to review it and go back and fix something so that it gets it out of there. But anyway, that I'm going to just look and see if I can recall anything else about it. And in general, we never have that in real life.
Linda, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi there, this is Nicole. So I just have two quick questions. My first question is, for every week, all we have to do is just whatever's in the chapter. So for chapter 3, we just have to do bins, and that's all that we need to do. And then for chapter 4, I think it's skeletons. Like there's no other additional assignments or whatever that we would be expected to do for that.
Exactly. Yeah, we won't do assignments until there are assignments on the schedule, and we'll talk about that when we're getting close to that time. So for right now, all you're doing in the schedule, it says chapter 1 and 2, chapter 3 and 4, chapter 5 and 6. That is exactly what you're working on. So it is mostly, it's good that the Sage textbook is very, step by step, showing you exactly what you need to do to learn Sage. And then when we get into close to the assignment date in this session on a Monday, or unless it's a holiday and we do it on a Wednesday, we'll talk about kind of what the assignment would entail.
Okay, and then my other question is, these PowerPoint slides, where are they posted to? Because I wasn't able to find the one for last week on Moodle.
Oh, I have a link on Moodle that says, here's the Zoom recording, and it takes you to YouTube where the video is saved with the slides as well as all the commentary. Because I don't figure the slides are very useful. The slides don't help without all the, I guess, commentary around it, right? And in this one, for example, we did the demo. That will be on the recording as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions?
Have a good weekend.
Okay, you too. I'm going to stop the recording and I'll post this on YouTube. So if you do want to go back and review, I know sometimes that might help. If you're like, oh, she went through the demo pretty quick, I want to go back and look at it. You'll obviously be able to do that as well. Have a great weekend, everybody.